What would you do if the entire system was built to silence you? Would you stand and fight, or let them bury the truth? Danielle Carter, a brilliant and resilient young black woman, never imagined she'd end up here, standing in a courtroom, facing a powerful enemy, accused of a crime she didn't commit. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let it break her. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles to let this one defeat her. Her mind raced, but her exterior remained calm. She had to stay focused. This was a fight she never wanted, but one she couldn't avoid. For years, Danielle had fought against a world that refused to see her as enough as a woman, enough as a black person, enough as someone who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. She had spent her entire life proving herself, only to be met with walls, with doubts, with the cold dismissal of those in power. But she had always found a way through, always found a way to keep pushing forward. This time, though, the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. The man accusing her, Ethan Calloway, stood across from her, his smug expression a testament to the privilege he had never had to question. Ethan was the son of a wealthy businessman, a man whose name carried weight in the city, whose influence could bend the law to his will. Ethan had grown up in a world where the rules didn't apply to him, where the consequences of his actions were always negotiable. Danielle knew this firsthand. She had seen it happen time and time again. People like Ethan, people who never had to face the consequences of their own misdeeds. The judge? An old friend of Ethan's father's, a man with a long history of letting people like Ethan get away with everything. Danielle knew that the scales of justice were already tipped against her. She had no allies in this room, no guarantees, nothing except the truth. But in this courtroom? Truth wasn't enough. Her eyes flickered to the jury, but they were hard to read. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with indifference. None of them knew her. None of them knew what she had fought for, what she had been through to get to this point. To them, she was just another defendant, just another face in the crowd. But Danielle knew who she was. She knew the truth of her own story, and she wasn't about to let anyone twist it. As Ethan's lawyer began to speak, his voice dripping with arrogance, Danielle couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. They were going to paint her as a criminal, accuse her of something she had never done. They were going to use every tactic they could, every ounce of power they had, to make sure that she lost. But Danielle wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. She had spent her life fighting for justice, fighting for the right to be seen, to be heard, to be valued. She had fought for the opportunity to prove herself. And now, in the face of a man who had everything, she was going to do the same. She wasn't going to let him win. Not now, not ever. The truth was on her side. It had to be enough. But as the prosecutor began his arguments, as the weight of the courtroom shifted further against her, Danielle realized that in a system like this, truth wasn't always enough. Power, privilege, and connections often held more sway than honesty and integrity. But she would fight. She would fight with everything she had. Because this wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been overlooked, every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. And so, Danielle stood tall. She would not shrink. She would not back down. This fight had come to her door, and she would face it head-on. What would you do if you were in Danielle's position? Let us know in the comments. He had the money, he had the power, and the judge was in his pocket. Ethan smirked as he leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, as though the case had already been decided. To him, this was just another obstacle to overcome, another story to manipulate. The truth didn't matter, not when he had the resources to bend the system to his will. He had framed Danielle for fraud, accusing her of stealing company funds from his father's business. But the real story was different. In reality, Danielle had been the one to expose Ethan's illegal dealings, the one who had brought his corrupt actions into the light. And now, the very system that should have protected her was turning its back on her. She was the one on trial, not Ethan. She was the one being punished for doing the right thing. The courtroom felt suffocating as Danielle sat there, her back straight, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She tried to keep her composure, but every glance from Ethan, every word from the judge made her feel smaller and smaller. This wasn't just a fight against one man. It was a fight against an entire system built to protect people like Ethan, people with money and power, while crushing those who dared to stand against them. Judge Whitmore, an old, bitter man with a history of bias, barely glanced at her as he flipped through the documents in front of him. His eyes skimmed over the evidence, but there was no real interest in his gaze. He wasn't here to find the truth. He was here to deliver a verdict that suited the man who paid his bills. He adjusted his glasses, sighing dramatically, as if Danielle's presence were a burden to him. "Miss Carter," Judge Whitmore said, his voice dripping with disdain, "you're just like your mother, but worse." Danielle's heart stopped. Her mother? Why bring her into this? Her mother, a brilliant woman who had fought tirelessly for justice, had faced a similar case years ago, a case that Judge Whitmore had ruled against her, a decision that had shattered her career, her reputation, and ultimately her life. The judge's words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had always known that the corruption ran deep, but hearing him invoke her mother's name, using it as a weapon, made it all the more personal. Danielle clenched her fists, the pain of her mother's ruined legacy threatening to overwhelm her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This wasn't just about fighting for her career or her future. It was about standing up for her mother, for everything that had been taken from her, and for the truth that was being buried under lies and corruption. The judge turned his gaze toward Ethan, his voice shifting from condescending to familiar, almost sympathetic. "Let's cut to the chase," Judge Whitmore continued, looking directly at Ethan. "Mr. Calloway, how much was stolen?" Ethan leaned forward in his chair, his voice oozing with arrogance. $200,000, Your Honor. I trusted Miss Carter, and she betrayed me." His words were cold, calculated, designed to make her seem like a thief, a traitor. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about his own self-preservation, about holding on to the life he had built on lies. The courtroom murmured as Ethan's claim hung in the air. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging glances, some whispering under their breath. The tension was palpable, and Danielle could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. But Danielle, she didn't flinch, because she had something they didn't expect. As Ethan continued to gloat, Danielle reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. She held it up, her gaze unwavering as the room fell silent. The judge looked at her, eyebrows raised in suspicion. "Your Honor," Danielle said, her voice steady, "I have evidence. Evidence that will prove I didn't steal a cent from Mr. Calloway's company." The courtroom went silent as the attention shifted to Danielle. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let them twist the truth any longer. This wasn't just about her. It was about justice. And for once, she was going to make sure the truth came out. What do you think Danielle's evidence holds? Let us know in the comments. They thought she would break. They thought she would beg. They were wrong. Danielle took a deep breath and walked toward the center of the courtroom, her steps steady, her shoulders squared. Every eye in the room was on her, watching for any sign of weakness, any crack in her composure. But there was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, just truth. With a calm, deliberate motion, she placed a single flash drive on the evidence table. It was small, insignificant-looking, but to Danielle it represented everything she had fought for. This was her moment, the moment when she would finally have her say, when she would expose the truth that had been buried for far too long. "Your Honor, I'd like to present my own evidence," Danielle said, her voice clear and firm. The judge, as expected, sighed, already dismissing her before she had even spoken. His disdain for her was palpable, and he made no effort to hide it. "Miss Carter, the court doesn't have time for games." "Then let's make this quick," she interrupted, her voice sharp, cutting through the judge's words like a knife. The courtroom gasped. No one interrupted Judge Whitmore. He was an institution, old, bitter, and never questioned. He held the power, and people knew better than to challenge him. But Danielle wasn't here to play by his rules. She wasn't here to be silenced. She was here to take back what had been stolen from her. And she wasn't going to let anyone, especially not Judge Whitmore, stop her. Without waiting for a response, she pressed play on the video. The screen flickered to life, the hum of the projector filling the silence of the courtroom. As the footage began to play, the room held its collective breath. On the screen was Ethan Calloway, caught in 4K, moving the stolen money into his personal offshore account. The footage was crisp, time-stamped, and unedited, undeniable evidence of Ethan's criminal activity. There was no mistaking it. There was no way to spin it. It was him, in all his arrogance, committing the very crime he had accused her of. Danielle's eyes locked with Ethan's as the video played out. The smug look on his face slowly faded as the truth became undeniable. His usual confident demeanor shattered, his eyes darting around the room, desperate to regain control. But it was too late. "You're looking at the real thief, Your Honor," Danielle said, turning to face the judge, her voice steady and resolute. "Now, do you want to tell the truth? Or should I keep going?" Ethan's face went pale. His usual arrogance vanished, replaced by something that could almost be described as fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, the man who had spent his life manipulating the system and getting away with it was the one on the defensive. The video spoke louder than any of his lies ever could. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the evidence pressing down on everyone in the room. Even Judge Whitmore, who had been so quick to dismiss Danielle, couldn't hide the flicker of unease in his eyes. For the first time, he looked nervous. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, adjusting his glasses as if hoping the truth would somehow disappear. But it wouldn't. Not this time. Danielle stood tall, her gaze never wavering. She had fought for this moment, fought for the right to be heard, and now, in front of everyone who had doubted her, she was claiming her victory. She had exposed Ethan for the fraud he was. She had taken down the wall of corruption that had protected him, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her life. Ethan opened his mouth again, but this time, his voice faltered. "This isn't what it looks like," he muttered, though even he knew his words were empty. Danielle didn't flinch. She knew this was just another attempt to manipulate the situation, to shift the blame. But it wouldn't work. Not now. Not when the truth was staring them all in the face. For the first time in that courtroom, The power had shifted. Ethan Calloway was no longer in control. The judge was no longer the one who called the shots. Danielle Carter had taken the reins, and nothing could take that away from her now. What do you think will happen next? Let us know in the comments. When lies fall apart, the guilty always panic. Ethan shot up from his seat, his face turning a deep shade of red. His breathing was rapid, his hands trembling as he pointed at the screen, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. "This is a setup," he shouted, his words laced with panic. "She's trying to frame me. This footage isn't real." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. But Ethan's outburst only seemed to reinforce the truth of Danielle's evidence. He was scrambling, trying to claw his way out of the hole he had dug for himself, but the walls were closing in on him fast. Judge Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face now pale, his usual composure shattered. He had spent years protecting people like Ethan, men with power, men with connections, who never had to answer for their actions. But now, things were different. There was no quick escape, no easy way out of this. "Miss Carter," Judge Whitmore said, his voice faltering slightly, "where did you obtain this footage?" Danielle stood tall, unwavering, her voice calm as ever. "From Calloway's own security system," she said. "It's all legal. I had access before he fired me." The words hung in the air, each syllable heavy with the truth. Ethan's face paled even further, and the judge hesitated, the weight of the situation sinking in. He had spent his career turning a blind eye, protecting the powerful and dismissing the marginalized. But this time, there was no way out for him. He couldn't continue to ignore the truth. "This is highly irregular," Judge Whitmore muttered, his voice shaky. Danielle didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, leaning slightly forward. "What's irregular is you letting a rich white man get away with stealing while trying to bury me." The courtroom gasped. Whispers rippled through the crowd, a mix of disbelief and shock at Danielle's boldness. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't afraid to speak the truth, no matter who it would anger or expose. For years, people like her had been silenced by men like Ethan and Judge Whitmore, but not today. Danielle's gaze never wavered from the judge, her eyes sharp, her words calculated. "This isn't the first time you've done this, is it, Your Honor?" The room fell deathly silent, every eye now on Danielle. The judge's face went from pale to visibly nervous, his jaw tightening as he shifted in his seat. Danielle didn't wait for him to respond. She reached into her bag and pulled out another document, this one thicker, more substantial. She held it up for everyone to see, the pages catching the light as she flipped through them. "I pulled your case history," she continued, her voice ringing clear. 90% of the time you rule against people who look like me, even when the evidence proves them innocent." She paused, letting the words sink in. The judge looked as though he had been hit with a truck. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was exposed, standing in the light for the first time, his years of bias and corruption laid bare before everyone. His connection to Ethan, his willingness to let the powerful get away with anything, was now undeniable. Ethan, however, had already begun to react. He was reaching for his lawyer, his face contorted in rage and disbelief. His arrogance had evaporated, and all that remained was the fear of being caught, of losing everything he had worked to protect. But it was too late. The truth had already come to light, and there was no escaping it now. The power in the room had shifted. For the first time, Danielle was in control. She didn't need to say more. The weight of her words, the evidence, and the audacity of her actions had already shifted the course of the trial. Danielle had done what everyone else had been too afraid to do. She had held the powerful accountable. As the judge sat in stunned silence, and Ethan tried to regain his composure, Danielle knew that the fight wasn't over, but she had already won the most important battle. She had stood up, she had spoken the truth, and she had exposed the corruption that had held her back for so long. The system may have been stacked against her, but in that moment, she had become the force that no one could ignore. What do you think will happen next in this fight for justice? Let us know in the comments. She wasn't fighting for just herself. She was fighting for every person the system had failed. Judge Whitmore hesitated, his fingers nervously tapping the edge of his gavel. For the first time in his career, he was trapped. The weight of the evidence in front of him was undeniable, and the truth was clear. Ethan Calloway was guilty. Everyone in the room knew it, from the jury to the reporters in the back of the courtroom. There was no escape for him, no way for his wealth and influence to shield him this time. The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension thick as the judge cleared his throat. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at Ethan, who was sitting there, stunned, still processing the fact that his power had finally failed him. After a long pause, Judge Whitmore spoke, his voice shaky, but resigned. "The charges against Miss Carter are hereby dropped," he said, his words almost mechanical. "The court will launch an investigation into Mr. Calloway's financial misconduct." Ethan's mouth fell open. For a brief moment, his arrogance evaporated, replaced with disbelief. His father's influence, which had always shielded him from consequences, couldn't save him now. Ethan sat frozen, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as if holding on to the remnants of his crumbling empire. The room was electric with the realization that justice had been served, not just for Danielle, but for everyone who had been victimized by men like Ethan. Danielle exhaled, her heart pounding in her chest, but her face remained calm. This battle was hers to win, but it was far from over. She turned to Judge Whitmore, her gaze unwavering, her voice as steady as ever. "And what about you, Your Honor?" she asked, her words piercing through the silence. "How many lives have you ruined? When will the investigation into you begin?" The courtroom erupted into chaos. The press rushed forward, cameras flashing, microphones raised. The journalists couldn't get their questions out fast enough. They had all been waiting for a moment like this, waiting for the system to be exposed, for the powerful to finally be held accountable. And now they had it. Judge Whitmore's face drained of color as he scrambled to regain control, but it was too late. His career, built on decades of protecting the rich and powerful, was crumbling before his eyes. The whispers in the courtroom turned into murmurs of outrage as the reality set in. He couldn't hide anymore. The truth had come for him too. Ethan's lawyer stood up, trying to protest, but Danielle's words had already struck a chord. The damage had been done. The press was already reporting on Whitmore's ties to the Calloway family, and the spotlight was on him now. There was no escaping the consequences. The judge's gavel trembled in his hand as he glanced nervously around the room. The once unshakable figure in the courtroom was now just another man exposed, a man whose influence had finally been unraveled. He tried to speak, to defend himself, but his voice faltered. Danielle stood tall, her gaze never leaving the judge. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged, for every voice that had been silenced by men like Whitmore and Ethan. Her fight wasn't over. It had just begun. As the courtroom continued to buzz with activity, Danielle knew that her victory in this room was just the first step. The battle for justice was far from won, but this was a significant turning point. She had shown everyone that the truth couldn't be silenced, no matter how powerful the forces trying to bury it were. She had exposed the corruption, and now the entire world was watching. Do you think justice will be served for Judge Whitmore? Let us know in the comments. Justice wasn't given to her. She took it. Danielle Carter walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, the weight of her victory settling over her like a cloak. She had done what many thought was impossible. She had exposed the corruption that had plagued her life, and she had forced the system to acknowledge it. The charges against her were dropped. Ethan Calloway was facing an investigation. Judge Whitmore was no longer the untouchable figure he had once been. For the first time, it felt like justice had been served. But Danielle knew it wasn't over. She had won today, but the system was still broken, still rigged to protect the powerful at the expense of everyone else. Her victory was just a small crack in a much larger wall. The fight wasn't done. It had only just begun. As she stepped outside the courthouse, the cool air hit her face, and the noise of the bustling city seemed to fade into the background. She had fought for this moment, but there was so much more to do. The world had just seen a glimpse of what she was capable of, but there were still so many others who needed the same justice she had fought for. She couldn't stop now. A reporter quickly ran up to her, microphone raised, eager to catch her thoughts. The camera clicked and flashed as they made their way toward her. "Ms. Carter, how does it feel to take down a corrupt judge?" the reporter asked, his voice filled with excitement. Danielle didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. This wasn't a moment for celebration. The battle had been hard fought, but the war was far from over. Her victory today was a personal triumph, yes, but it was also a small step toward something much larger. "I didn't take him down," she said, her voice steady, her words sharp and clear. "I just showed the world who he's always been." Her words hung in the air as she looked past the reporter, her gaze focused on something only she could see. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It wasn't just about one victory. This was about a system that had failed too many people for too long, a system that needed to be dismantled piece by piece. Judge Whitmore was just one small part of it. Ethan Calloway was just one small part of it. The corruption ran much deeper. The reporter didn't know how to respond. He had expected a soundbite, a quick answer that would fit neatly into the narrative they had already written in their heads. But Danielle wasn't giving him that. She wasn't interested in the limelight. She was interested in justice, real justice. And with that, she walked away, her steps purposeful, her focus unwavering. The sound of the reporter calling after her faded as she made her way down the steps and onto the street. She didn't need to look back. She had done what she set out to do, and the world had seen the truth. But that wasn't enough for her. It never would be. She was already thinking ahead, already planning what came next. There were still so many battles to fight, so many people to help, so many injustices to correct. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Danielle had taken a stand, and the world was watching. The fight for justice wasn't over, and she wasn't going to stop fighting until every last piece of corruption was exposed and torn down. Would you have done what Danielle did? Let us know in the comments. Like and share if you believe in fighting for justice.